This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm Gaius. Germanicus is here. We are men of Rome in the 1st century AD in Londinium. We know where we are, thanks to Strabo, the geographer. We can fix the road back to Rome, and we have no interest in taking it. Nor are we eager for anyone from Rome to come here. We're quite happy with retired centurions who've taken up this new habit of taking their cup of wine and coming over and listening to us because they're puzzled and pleased that we talk about the 21st century and assure them that all their work and their risk and the loss of their comrades and the legions, they're retired now with families, all of that comes to great success 20 centuries from now with the American Empire supreme, built on the Roman foundations. Their loyalty, their service, their model will be the strength of the United States of America in the 21st century. At the same time, we look to our life in the 1st century for analogies or models or something we're comfortable with of what we're seeing in the American Empire, with the hypothesis that empires repeat themes. This hypothesis, or as a clever man once said, doesn't repeat, it rhymes. Well, there's a rhyme now in the American Empire that is very familiar to us and has risk. The Tiberius model. Tiberius, a very successful general, the son of the queen of the Roman Empire, Augustus's wife. However, once he became emperor in 14 AD, with the death of Augustus, our God and Savior, he was very little interested in being emperor. Eventually, he assigned the duties of office to a trusted assistant named Sejanus, head of the Praetorian Guard, and retired to an island where he entertained himself not being the emperor. That went on for a number of years before he moved in 31 Common Era AD to remove Sejanus, and the last years of his reign were chaotic. He was succeeded by chaos as well. And here we are at the end of the 1st century, and we've not quite recovered. We're not quite recovered from the disruptions of Tiberius's reign. What's important to Germanicus and I, and we're doing this live because we come together on Sundays to think out loud, not to plan our responses. We're not attorneys, after all. We're amateur historians in the 1st century, looking at the 21st century and everything in between, and speculating. As Equus class, we don't work, we're retired men. We have Greeks who work for us. We're very good, and we trust them. Yes, they're called slaves sometimes, but you know, our Greeks buy their ways out of service, and their children become Roman citizens. It's all very successful and legal in the 1st century. Back to what we're looking at now is the Tiberius model, which is a man who's aged and has the risks of age. That was true from the conversations we had during the previous emperor, Mr. Biden. And it's true again with Mr. Trump. And Mr. Trump is not alienated from it. In these last days, there have been remarks by his vice president who says, paraphrasing, "If there's tragedy, I'm ready." And the president who says that it's important to prepare succession. All very sensible and grown up. So I come to you, Germanicus, lessons learned from the Tiberius model in our time, and with the example of Joe Biden, for example, or the FDR example, that 4th election in 44, which can be seen in retrospect as not responsible because the succession was not fixed, and there was great turmoil in the Oval Office during that critical summer of 45. Right now, we have a president who is in contest with the other party and the courts. However, it appears that he's quite firmly in control. But you and I both know that that's today. Tomorrow, and the actuary tables tell the tale. So what did we learn from our Tiberius in the 1st century? What did we learn from Joe Biden's Tiberius in the 21st? What can we learn today to the way Mr. Trump appears to be preparing us for a new direction? Good evening to you, Germanicus.
Good evening, Gaius. After the Battle of Actium, 131 BC. Augustus was a young and vigorous emperor. Rome had not had anything like an emperor except the prototype himself, Gaius Julius Caesar. But Augustus had an incredibly capable second in command in Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. And the empire was in good hands. And the adopted sons of Augustus, Tiberius was one, and were excellent generals and were able to maintain a Roman strategy throughout the next 40 years, tumultuous as it was. And Romans got used to having one guy who was the rock of stability, and as they all called him, the father of the country. And it was something that had to end. And when it ended, they were able to easily acclaim a successor who still wasn't quite in his dotage yet. But as he grew older, he was, unlike Augustus, careless and irresponsible and narcissistic is the best judgment of writers like Suetonius. And he played havoc with the stability of Rome. And as a result of the experience of Tiberius and the chaos that followed with Caligula, Rome really went through a process of coming to terms with the fact that the emperor needed to be a young and vigorous person. And that was the pathway that Rome took. You did have Nerva, who would succeed Domitian, and he was older, but he was understood to be a transitional figure. And looking at the history of Rome through the next 15 centuries, it is always the strong and the young who then become emperor. And that the times when you had an old emperor like Andronicus II at the end of the 13th and first decades of the 14th century, it was a disaster for Rome. And this is something that has to be learned and relearned. You mentioned FDR, and after FDR, there was a push really for younger men to step in, and you had eventually the junior officers of World War II, Nixon, Kennedy, all the way to George H.W. Bush, were the young men who was the successor generation after World War II. And I think we're facing, right now, the recognition that the Romans had to deal with at the end of the reign of Augustus through to the period where an aged, infirm Tiberius was losing his grip on leadership. And I think this is partly to explain the shift that's going on, at least so far within the Republican Party, to go with quite a young man in the form of Mr. Vance, but also a tendency that I think we're going to see come 2028 with the Democratic Party as well.
I want to go to the model of Eisenhower, who was in his 60s, choosing Richard Nixon, a very young man at the time, 39, when he entered into the process. That turned out to be very successful because it was a good choice. Nixon was savvy and capable and energetic. The other example I can think of is George H.W. Bush choosing a younger man who did not go forward to become the president, and Bill Clinton choosing a younger man who was his age, Al Gore. Those models are good because they provide for what comes next, Plan B. I also look at the Tiberius model under Joe Biden and see what can go wrong, which is not only Joe Biden was aged, but so was the leadership of the Democratic Party.
It very much was a Tiberius moment because Kamala Harris was as infirm a choice as was Caligula centuries earlier.
What we then learn from Tiberius is that age is a factor. It shouldn't be left out. I credit Mr. Trump for being candid about it. He has children and grandchildren, and he thinks about his legacy. You think about it. And I don't know that younger people understand this, Germanicus.
Right.
You and I think about it each day because we can't, at our age, and I mentioned the actuarial tables, that's only an independent critic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You do not recover quickly when you're older. Your systems don't operate the same way. And a colleague of mine, a long-standing colleague of great intelligence and warmth, fell earlier this year and has now left us. Just fell. Nothing, not cancer, not the heart, not a heart attack, fell. And I know that you and I proceed through the day understanding that gravity is a frenemy. It's not to be taken for granted. So Mr. Trump is wise to talk about these things. I don't know that America's talking about them. What I learned also from Tiberius and listening to you is that he made some bad choices. And I wonder if that was a function of his aging process. You know, there was those questions about Joe Biden's ability to be cogent.
Right, right. The experience of both Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump confirms beyond any question that we live in an emperor system now, that our constitutional order revolves around not an executive, not just a leader figure, but an emperor, an emperor who is now institutionalized and is expected by the people to do miraculous things. So we have effectively what was understood in other cultures and other times as a kind of sacred king, in which the health of the emperor is also directly connected to the health of the nation, the body politic. And that is an issue of transcendent importance. And so you'll see, no matter what significant dynamics are roiling the world in the last week, the focus of Americans has been on Mr. Trump's health. And I think this kind of highlights the conundrum that the U.S. is in, because we're in a transition now. And once we all take on board the fact that this is an emperor system, which may, swap out every 4 or 8 years in an election, is nonetheless very different from the constitutional order that preceded it in America. And the age issue kind of is teasing that out for all of us to see.
You Gen Xers and you millennials and you Gen Z, and then I think the new generation is called Alpha. We know about this. It's okay to talk to us about it. It's part of being here, and it's part of why we're police. You're here. If I wasn't this old, my children wouldn't be like that, and I find that unacceptable. Now, we turn to something that's more fun. The Federal Reserve, the Vestal Virgins, when we come back. Germanicus is Michael Vlahos. Gaius is John Batchelor. The Centurions are rolling their eyes. This is Londinium, the Friends of History Debating Society. We'll be right back. This is the debate. I am Germanicus is here. We're in Londinium by the Thames on a summer evening, late summer. The flowers have gone. What's left now is the fall colors and then winter coming on. We've been thinking about older and wiser. We turn now to a melodrama. In our day, the Vestal Virgins were the contract keepers. That's how we used them. You make a contract and it's kept at the temple, or the Vestal Virgins take charge of it. There's much emphasis on the word virginity. That wasn't what was important. It was trust. The Vestal Virgins were the focus of trust in the Roman worthiness. And to approach them in any other fashion was reckless. At the same time, there was a burden on them to maintain the face of nonpartisanship, is what they called it in the 20th century, and trust, and at the same time to remain aloof, to honor the Roman citizen and the Roman state when called upon in ceremony, and otherwise to remain silent or withdrawn. To be a Vestal Virgin was a great privilege. And then there was trouble, now and again, when a Vestal Virgin, member of this trustworthy group, departed from what was acceptable, perhaps a man, perhaps money, perhaps her father, and there were harsh penalties if convicted. I mention all this because it occurs to me, reading the news of the 21st century, the Federal Reserve conducts itself as if it's outside of politics, as if it's outside of risk, which is acceptable, yes, but then it runs into moments like this where, to lay the facts out, a member of the Federal Reserve Board, nominated by the previous emperor, Cook by name, is identified as a person who may, the allegation has not been filed in court, but it's just talk, may have misled on mortgage applications and before becoming a member of the Federal Reserve Board. The emperor did not wait and took to the airwaves immediately to say, "You're fired." Since then, there's much hemming and hawing and court proceeding, lots of lawyers. I bring this up because the Federal Reserve is useful, but at the same time, it is not outside of the emperor and the emperor's reach, except it would appear that the Americans think it is. Germanicus, I need your opinion on this because I'm not sure whether the Americans perceive that the Federal Reserve is part of the government. I don't know. I can't tell. It was invented at the beginning of the century to answer a problem that came up in 1907 when the markets failed and had to be bailed out by J.P. Morgan and his friends.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't become so-called independent until 1951. So from that period of 1914 through the Depression and the war, it was not independent at all. It was very much seen as a function of the government. But since 51, since legislation was written by the Congress, it's had this word independent. And that confuses people now. Is it outside the emperor's reach? Is the simple, straightforward question.
This is an evolutionary process in terms of those things that are outside the orbit of the state. So in the Republic, the Senate did not have control over the Vestal Virgins. Only the Pontifex Maximus could say fire a Vestal Virgin, or he was the man ultimately commanding the priestesses of the Temple of Vesta. And when Augustus became emperor, part of this whole institutional shift in the constitutional order, he became Pontifex Maximus. So the emperor was now in charge of the Vestal Virgins. And this is important because the blurring of the lines between religion and politics was a critical element, a kind of gray area in Rome, just as it is in the U.S. And to push the metaphor a little further, Vesta, the goddess Vesta, was goddess of the hearth. the hearth had to be maintained. There was an eternal flame in the temple of Vesta, and it protected Rome. If the flame went out, Rome was no longer protected. So the Vestal Virgins were really protecting the identity of Rome and the rectitude of Rome, meaning its overall integrity and stainless qualities, were vested in them physically and personally. And they had to be beyond reproach. And I think in America, the almighty dollar and the monetary system that keeps us, as it were, in imperial gravy, is our version of the hearth of Vesta. And there were 6 Vestal Virgins. Well, there's 7 governors on the Federal Reserve, and they're nominated by the Pontifex Maximus for terms, just as the Vestal Virgins serve terms, both long terms, 30 years for the Vestal Virgins and only 14 for the Federal Reserve, but it's still a resonant metaphor. And the key here is that essentially an institution like the Vestal Virgins or like the Federal Reserve are a part of the constitutional order. They're not independent outside of the state, and certainly not outside of the emperor. And that is why when a Vestal Virgin, in this case, one of the Board of Governors, is either suspected of or has committed a breach of sacred trust, well, then it is within the authority of the emperor to dismiss her.
And the now is between the partisans who say the Federal Reserve is independent, and if it's compromised, it will damage the American economy, the dollar, the trust between nations. It's as if they have no memory of the first part of the 20th century when that was not an independent body, not protected or in some fashion empowered by the word of the Congress. And I puzzle if we're not watching America once again review its trust in the emperor.
You can't have trust without some superordinate authority that can enforce unimpeachable behavior. And that was true of the Vestal Virgins, and it has to be true of the Federal Reserve. It has to be under some authority, because people do misbehave, and the key to the Federal Reserve's own authority and legitimacy is the trust that we repose in it. And if that trust is betrayed, well, then there has to be a response. And it's impossible to have the Federal Reserve play such an important role symbolically and actually, as the Vestal Virgins did, in the polity of Rome, without having it under the higher authority. It's just not going to work. You can't have a fractured constitutional order. And frankly, the importance of the Federal Reserve means that it must be within some kind of accountability.
And therefore, let's go to Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve. The president wants him to lower interest rates. Simple, make money cheaper. All presidents want money cheaper. All presidents borrowing money cheaper. All presidents want the Federal Reserve to cut rates. It's a sign of confidence. It's a sign of growth. It's associated with success. Jerome Powell says no. As a Roman, I find that unwise of Jerome Powell. He's come up with various explanations in time, but presenting himself as outside the emperor's reach does not make me trust Jerome Powell. It makes me suspicious that this is personal with him and not about the institution. Saying yes, sir, and giving you reasons why you don't, that's one thing. But he's consistently defied the emperor and made it clear he's in defiance of the emperor. This present melodrama with the question about one of his board of governors, I might have missed it because here I am in the first century and I don't see everything going on in the important rooms in the 21st. But I've not seen Jerome Powell come out and explain to the American people why should we trust in him and the Federal Reserve when there are these questions about his leadership, and now a question about a member of the board who votes. I see nothing from them. It's as if they're outside. This does not come to a happy ending in our first century.
No.
Perhaps we'll be lucky again, but it's not headed in a good direction right now.
Well, I mean, in our time, there are senatorial appointments to govern provinces that are the purview of the Senate and not the emperor, with some key provinces. But they still serve at the pleasure of the emperor, even though they're appointed by the Senate. And I think it has to be remembered that the Federal Reserve Board is not part of the original constitutional system that is laid out in our founding document. And therefore, any kind of arrangements made, like the legislation from 1951, don't endow the board with full independence and autonomy from the state. They're part of the state. The independence part is ambiguous. It means that their decisions are not to be controlled by capriciously by the emperor. And of course, that may change, and it had been different before 1951. So clearly, it's not something that is constitutionally embedded in the Federal Reserve. It is something that was a shift in practice with legislation attached, which how binding that is, I don't know, but the Federal Reserve does not occupy the same constitutional terrain, say, as a state or as the division between the three branches of the federal government. It's like the Vestal Virgins. It is under the purview of the emperor.
Germanicus is Michael Vlahos. I am John Batchelor Gaius. One more matter, though, that comes up because I've been carefully preparing myself to talk about Clodia of Metellus, the richest woman in Rome at the time of Cicero and Caesar and Crassus and Pompey, the drama of the first century BCE. So when we come back, women with money in Rome and women with money in America in the 21st century, do they have anything in common? This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm John Batchelor. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. We're in Londinium by the Thames, enjoying ourselves. The Centurions are less engaged than usual because we're not talking about anybody dying, any backstabbing. They love that stuff. We've assured them that their sacrifice throughout the 25 years they served in the legions will come to great success in the 21st century. So just because somebody's not dead doesn't mean it's not important, guys, okay? Now look, we're going to turn to a topic that is of interest in the 21st century more than in the first century AD of Rome, Common Era. And that's women with money. I'm reading a book about Claudia of Metelli, one of the famous families. One of her grandfathers built the Appian Way, for heaven's sakes. They're everywhere. She was born in 95 BCE. Caesar was born just a few years before, so they're contemporaries. She was married at 17, had a child. Her husband died. He was an older man. And she inherited a great deal of wealth in the Palatine, south of Rome, along the coast, outside of Herculaneum, land everywhere. And she didn't need to marry again, so she didn't, and lived an independent life of great luxury on the Palatine Hill when she was in Rome, and the elite lived very well and entertained themselves with trivia games at night while they were drinking. Well, one day, a man named Cicero denounced Claudia in a murder trial and defamed her. And Claudia pushed back hard for quite some time. You might remember the end of Cicero. That's his picture behind me, denouncing Catiline. Cicero did not come to a happy ending. This suggests to me that women in Rome, though they were denied the power of the purse, they had to have an advisor, a conservator, like a brother or a father or an uncle. Though they were not permitted in court, though they were not given credit for their authority, had a great deal of money. They inherited it, and they exercised political power. So we come to the 21st century, and America has now endeavored several times to aggrandize and endorse a woman for the presidency. And I puzzled to Germanicus because this is not an easy course. It just came to me reading about Claudia. That politics and money in Rome were the same thing. And I believe that's true in America. I know I'm being simplistic and reductionist, but that's where we go sometimes when we're comparing something 2,000 years apart. And that as of yet, Germanicus, I cannot think of an example of a woman with money, and I mean wealth, billions, saying or indicating that she and her entourage wanted political power. That hasn't come yet. And when it does, will that be the first empress?
I think it's important here when looking at Rome, which was a very different society than that of the United States in the 20th and then 21st centuries. And the fact is that in traditional societies, which is everything up to the 20th century, you have women playing a powerful role in politics behind the scenes. And very often it's a matter of class, almost exclusively. But very often it's really about money. And you have extremely powerful women in Rome. Livia is one of the most memorable. But you have extremely powerful women in, say, Georgian Britain, or in the court of Louis XV with Madame de Pompadour and Madame de Berry. But what happens in the 20th century in the United States is that women begin to have more and more wealth and more influence and control over wealth. And that is something that has sort of galloped ahead in the last 50 years. And so this goes across the board. It isn't simply the countesses or the duchesses that count. And so it's predicted that by 2028, women will own 75% of all discretionary spending in the U.S. But also, women influence. Women have over 66% of the consumer wealth in the U.S., and they have 51% of all stocks. So this has been a process that has gathered a lot of momentum. And as a result, women have enormous leverage on all aspects of culture, but also all aspects of the consumer society. And The other point I think that needs to be made is that the role of billionaires in politics is opened up as well. In the past, you mentioned J.P. Morgan bailing out the U.S. government, which he did, and endowing the National Gallery of Art, which he did, and Carnegie, um, building libraries and creating institutes all over the U.S. These men had enormous wealth. Uh, uh, so did John D. Rockefeller, for example, but they were not engaged directly in politics. And what you have recently is the emergence of billionaire politicians. And women are late to this game, but they're coming to their own. So that you have, for example, Steve Jobs' wife, who owns the Atlantic and has a huge impact in terms of her quote unquote charitable or political charitable giving. And it's only a small step to get to the point where this sort of ability to influence gets translated into a family dynasty. And in some ways, it already has with the Pritzkers in Illinois. And I think it might break out to the open elsewhere as well. Now, to add further to the mix, the influence of women politically grew in Rome, especially after Rome became Christian, after Constantine's tectonic decision. And Rome in the 4th and 5th centuries was dominated by unbelievably rich senators. In fact, in the 5th century in the Western Empire, there were 3 senators. This must have been in the 420s or so. There were 3 senators, each of whom had more wealth than the imperial state itself. And so when these guys died and their widows were there with all that money, they were essentially the political players in the Western Empire in the 5th century. And they had the money to create the network of monasteries and churches and fund them. And this was the network that gave birth to the successors to Rome, the successor to Rome essentially being the church itself. And so this is a process that will undoubtedly continue. And the interesting dimension to this is the extent to which the billionaires will become the new dukes and counts and marquises of American politics, which is what they were in the Dark Ages. So what we might be looking at down the road is a political system whose dynamics are effectively a struggle between the emperor and the state on one hand, and these extraordinarily powerful billionaire politicians on the other. And we've seen hints of that, as you know, already.
One more detail about money and power, politics. In the 1st century BCE, the one that's romantic, Crassus had great power. Great power, more than Brutus would have inherited from his mother, certainly more than Pompey the Great. And Caesar was always in debt. But Crassus, and the way he got his money was that he bought up damaged properties after fires. It was very clever on his part. It was like he moved into junk bonds. He was good. If he doesn't die, he's the man who becomes the emperor. Right there is my observation. A century and a half later. Do we need to say that out loud about America, that they're headed towards a billionaire president? Given that Mr. Trump, I understand, makes claims that way, but he's
headed toward a what president?
A billionaire president.
Oh, yeah. Well, here's what I have to say about that. Everyone has been worried for the last 20 years at the increasing disproportion of wealth and income in the United States,
right,
which is now at levels that are depending on your point of view, better or worse than those of the Ancien Regime in France right before the Revolution. It's extraordinary. And everyone wondered, well, what will this do? Will it lead to revolution? And guess what? In Rome, it led to exactly what you're describing, the end of the Republic, which was a revolution, but the emergence of the billionaire politicians. And, if Caesar was in debt, he was able to lay claim very easily to massive wealth. And Augustus, although he was not a top man in wealth, once he became emperor, that soared. So what I would expect to see is potentially the same pathway for the United States. So all of this inequality of wealth and income is leading us to the most unimaginably, again, depending on your point of view, good or bad outcome. And again, we become more and more like Rome every single day.
Germanicus is Michael Vlahos. I am Gaius John Batchelor in Londinium. We're self-satisfied that we've once again secured the Roman Empire in the 21st century. This is the Friends of History Debating Society on a beautiful summer evening, and I hope it is for you. I'm John Batchelor.